Welcome to Tommy Solo's Famous Friends. This is part 2 of my 2020 interview with Frank Soda. Where we left off in part 1, the band had just signed to Quality Records and their manager convinced Frank to replace the rhythm section for the Saturday Night Getaway album. Now, we continue the story from there.
You can't not have a road manager because, you guys still want to go up and not tune your drums or move your gear and all that. You know what I mean, right? So it was one of those things that happened with the imps. And so he ended up just hiring those two. But later on, like I said, we still remain friends and stuff,
Right. Well, you mentioned Lee Aaron. I'll tell you that probably the only reason that I heard of her to begin with was because there were people like yourself and I think Rick Santers and maybe Moxie singer Buzz Shearman.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, she had an all-star lineup on her first record. And like I say, if it hadn't been for your name and Rick Santers, etc., I might not have ever heard that first album.
That's right, yeah, but it was also Rick Emmett of Triumph was on that, too.
Right.
And Buzz Sherman of Moxie. Yeah, well, what happened was the manager, Bob Conley, at the time, he had a musical background. He had a band called Starcraft. I can't remember his band. So he was very experienced. So he put together stuff like that. He was the guy that saw Karen, Lee Aaron playing. And then he said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to launch this. And he got me to write a song, Rick Emmett, Santers, and Buzz Sherman and stuff. And then which also later led to that live simulcast that we ended up doing too,
Cool. Yeah. So then after you played on her debut album and contributed as a songwriter, you ended up doing a 5-song EP, The Adventures of Soda Man. That was something that was a little bit ahead of its time as well.
Yeah, well, that's it. See, that's Bob Conley, the manager. He says, well, Frank, you're not really doing much right now. Why don't we just do something like an EP thing? Because he had connections to get stuff pressed and stuff. And we said, we'll just do it in the basement. He says, we'll just do that, and then we'll present it as a gift, to record executives, to radio people, and blah, 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 that type of idea. It was a promotional tour, really is what it was. And from there, so that's what he thought. He said, well, why don't we just do something we'll call The Adventures of Soda Man, and then we can put together a little video on it. And that's what ended up happening was he ended up getting me to sort of write songs and an idea about this guy coming from another planet, that sort of idea, to save the earth. But he said, forget it, let's just party type of idea. And then he said, just put any kind of songs like that together, and then we'll put video and a nice EP and then use it as promo. So that's how that happened,
Yeah, well, the picture disc, I mean, that was certainly ahead of its time.
Yeah. I thought the music wasn't, like I said, I didn't, because it was done kind of in the basement, we used Linn drums at the time, that we didn't really spend as much time musically on that. That's my only regret there, Once again, it's getting to be all the flash and the glitter and the show as opposed to sitting there doing the music. I was going to do basement stuff as a demo and then maybe start working more on the songs. But that's what happened. So we just sort of said, we haven't got enough of a budget now. Let's just present it like this and then we'll go from there. So that's what ended up happening. So I thought the music didn't live up to expectations of what I wanted it to be anyway,
Right. Sometimes the machine just rolls on. So then how did you end up in a duo with ex-Max Webster keyboardist Terry Watkinson?
Okay, so at the time, because we had a following, the Frank Soda and the Imps had a following with the show, we could always keep playing and doing things. So what happened was, at the time of the simulcast, I was playing with Brian Gagnon and Glenn Grado. Now, Brian Gagnon, he was always trying to talk me into, we toured back and forth across Canada, and the early 80s, that time period, I can't remember the exact year, but something like that, just after the release of Saturday Night Getaway anyway. And Brian was always trying to talk me into doing what I'm talking about. He said, Frank, we should get into the studio and do more of this. So he ended up leaving the band after a couple of tours and saying, I'd rather spend more time in the studio. But at the time, Terry Watkinson was let go from Max Webster, and he ended up saying, well, Tilka says, well, Frank, why don't you just grab Terry there and do that, add him to your band, which we did. But the problem was, at the time, he had just a child that was born, his daughter, and then my son was born at that time, because we had both just started family. Well, he had a family from before, but this was a new addition to his family, right? And then he said, well, Jesus, why don't we just do a duo thing, take the band off the road, because he didn't want to travel and tour as much, and he didn't want that kind of a headache. So that became a duo, and he was ahead of his time because he sequenced all the drums, he did all that, played left-handed bass, and we did that for quite a while.
Nice. Yeah, I ended up for a while in a band with a keyboardist that played left-hand bass, and at the time that was one of the craziest things I'd ever seen. I thought it was going to really suck, but for some reason in the 80s they had keyboards that you could play left-hand bass and it sounded okay.
Oh, I know, no kidding. No, to this day they can sound awesome.
Yeah, that's crazy. So then you do that, and then 1988 finds you behind a girl group called the Pop-Tarts. How did that happen?
Oh, yeah, well, the Pop-Tarts. Well, what happened was, it was a decision I had to make, basically. I was happy in Toronto, and don't get me wrong, and I'd made a lot of connections, a lot of friends, and everything else. But my dad got ill in Vancouver. He got very sick. So Sam Feldman, the agency that was booking bands and stuff like that, I said, well, listen, I'm going to go see what's happening with my dad, and I'd like to book a tour across Canada, and then maybe stay in Vancouver for a while to see how, hopefully things go well with my dad. So I'd like to book a tour. But at the time, I didn't really have a band because I'd kind of taken the band off the road, and I had done the duo with Terry. And of course, Terry's not going to come out with me and move to Vancouver or do whatever, it's one of those things. I can't just say, hey, Terry, can you do this with me, So I said, let's just put together a little project. And I'd known Tessa Kimmel. She had an all-girl band. And so my manager, I think Bob Conley was telling me about them as well. He says, why don't you just put this together as a little project, go across Canada on tour, and see how your dad's doing, that type of idea. You stay there for a while, maybe. So it became one of those. It was just like a little project, fun. The girls were actually good. And, it was something interesting to do. But it never really got anywhere because when I came to Vancouver, of course, my dad was pretty ill and I had to make a decision. Do I stay? That type of idea. And I ended up staying. Right.
Well, family comes first. And, sometimes it takes us a while to realize that. You've got to get out there on the road and sow your wild oats and so on. And all of a sudden you realize what's really important. So
yeah, exactly.
Speaking of family, I know that you also are in a duo with your wife called Classic Soda, and I can tell you that one of the best things that's ever happened to me was meeting my wife, who's very much behind the music and is my muse. So that's a lucky thing when you've got somebody with you who's that supportive. But to go on the road with your wife, that's pretty awesome.
That is. Well, what ended up happening was when I met Joyce, when I met my wife, she had actually been in the music business herself. But at the time, we weren't together at all. She had been dating someone else, and she was with someone else. That's the idea. So I knew she was musical, and, she was a model type. So she had known about the business. She had known that, And I know after a couple of years of back and forth touring, she ended up breaking up with the boyfriend at the time, and that's when we sort of connected. And so I knew that she was into music and everything else. But once we started a family, and then we came out here to Vancouver, Vancouver is one of those scenes where there's a lot of cover stuff. So that's what we ended up doing. We ended up just putting that as a side project, just to keep us, you make a little extra money, keep your fingers moving, you know what I mean? And you have fun just doing stuff like that. That's how that started.
Nice. So then 1998, you signed with Pacemaker Records and put out a greatest hits on CD.
Oh, yeah. That came to be a bit of a court case almost.
And we'll be right back after this.
What happened was, Pacemaker had phoned me and said, hey, Frank, we want to just release some of your old stuff from the records onto like a CD, blah, blah, blah. It was in the 90s, late 90s or whatever. And I said, well, I'm sure that you can. Let me phone my manager. I phoned my manager. I phoned the lawyer that had done all that. And basically they said that, oh, yeah, I think all the rights revert to you after 10 years. So I ended up saying, yes, yeah, go ahead, just release it. So they took some songs from the album, they just sort of mastered them again, and they re-released it, and that was fine. Ended up going to Toronto to do a couple of shows there, and then they put a cease and desist order on that because the record company, Quality Records, they gone bankrupt, and they sold to a label from Montreal. They found out about it, and so they sued Tastemaker Records. Now, I think it's all been worked out, but at that time, I couldn't even go out and do the shows there because of that. They put a cease and desist on that.
Wow. That's just crazy.
Well, because I didn't know what I was doing at the time. When I signed stuff back then, God, I was only in your early 20s, whatever it is, when you're signing, you're going, well, yeah, let's just get this going, you know, you don't know what you're signing. Meanwhile, they have the rights to it, and even when they went bankrupt, they still have the rights to it, you know, so.
Yeah, it's funny. I was offered a record deal when I was in my early 20s, and I had an uncle who was an entertainment lawyer and advised me against it, basically because, well, you know, they give you an advance, yada, yada, and he just said it wasn't a good deal. But then years and years later, I signed a distribution deal for one song off a fairly recent album. I read the contract and I laughed the whole time. I thought, this is half of nothing and half of that half of nothing and whatever. And I just thought, well, I know what's going on, so whatever. You know, it's not the end of the world. Nobody's making money in this business anymore anyway, you know.
Oh, I know. No kidding. Oh, I know.
But hindsight being 2020, man, yeah, there's some pretty scary stories out there about people that were on top of the world and are homeless today, etc. So kudos for being a survivor.
Well, you know what? Like I said, with me, I ended up coming to Vancouver, and I did like music, and I also did like part-time jobs, and I did different things, you know, because I didn't want to travel. So I ended up right now that I can live off some of that. You know what I mean? I can live off some of the money that I made with that. Some musicians, they don't have that at all. They kept just doing just music, and I feel bad for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, are you still the vice president of the Pacific Songwriters Association?
No. I tell you what ended up happening with that. When I first moved out here, the fellow that was doing it asked me to do him a favor. He says, Frank, can you come here? I got this organization and this and that, and he needed me to do it. So I would do a little sort of where people bring songs in, then you analyze them and you do that, you know. So I was there doing a bit of that. Then he asked me if I could take over the duties or whatever it is as the president. And at that time, I had just moved here, and I said, you know what, I'll help out. But ended up that Pacific Songwriters Association, it basically sort of got together with the Songwriters Association of BC or whatever, you know what I mean? So that title was kind of taken away. It was like a different kind of Songwriters Association kind of took over. It wasn't just the Pacific, it was the whole, I think, Canada thing, you know?
Right.
So it's kind of been dissolved, you know? But I still kind of keep my fingers in it. If someone sends songs in, or he still, you know, he'll phone me up and say, there's a clinic there, you know, and I'll go check it out, see if I can add my 2 bits.
Right. So you went from being an influencer to a mentor.
Yeah, exactly. You know, like, I mean, songwriting is it's one of those things where, you know, it can be very individual. What you may think is a great song, someone else, they may not think it's a great song at all. So if someone brings a song in and it was a real progressive type of song, I'll say, well, if you're going into that market, you got to decide, are you going to go into that market to be a progressive type? You know, because if you're doing that, you're doing the right thing. That's good. If you're going to be commercial, you know what I mean, that sort of thing, well, then maybe that's the wrong thing. So that's kind of what advice I would give, you know, in the direction that they were going.
Right. Well, you've had a long and illustrious career, and it's kind of cool to know that once the world turns back on, you're still actively involved in playing. Editor's note, we recorded this interview originally during the big COVID lockdown. Now back to the show. I don't know that I have any more questions for you, Frank, but having said that, I like to let my guests have the last word on the show, so I'll let you say whatever you like to the people at this point.
Well, basically, you know, during this COVID-19 thing, I've been doing a lot of reflecting on everything, because it's so funny that you even mentioned doing an interview with me and everything else. Yeah, I've just been reflecting on how I go into my studio and I go, gee, all these songs, but something came up and I didn't end up finishing them, or these guitar parts that I used to practice all the time. Like, remember when I used to, you know, met you in Thunder Bay, I would always be practicing and doing, and then I kind of let that slide. I didn't practice as much, you know what I mean? It's been a very reflective time for me, so what you got to do is just take whatever you got now and just brush up on what you want to do And so that's what I'm doing. I'm basically just trying to see what songs I want to finish. I'm collaborating with like Mike Tilka, Terry Walkerson still, from Toronto. They're sending tracks out. I'm collaborating with all my friends and stuff out here. So it's a good time to just sit there and say, what do I really want to do? I mean, back in the day when I first met you, you had years and years ahead of you saying, well, I can do whatever I want, the big wide open road, But now, as you get older, you got to sort of pick and choose. You're not going to be Steve Vai, or you're not going to be so-and-so, but here's what I want to do with these songs. So, you just got to know where you are at this time of your life and just sort of focus on that. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do. Brush up on songs on guitar that I want to finish and collaborate with friends and people that I've met and stuff through the years.
Well, it sounds to me like you're doing what I've chosen to do, and that's to live, love, and live life for the love of life.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Frank, I started to do this podcast for fun, and thanks to you, this has been another fun one. So I thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to share your stories with me, and until next time, cheers.
Well, until next time for sure. And when I'm back on Ontario there, like I say, when this thing sort of subsides, I got lots of people to visit and stuff in Ontario. I'll definitely give you a shout or something. I'll let you know I'm heading that way.
That sounds like a plan. Well, now that was a lot of fun. Frank Soda has often been described as a seminal Canadian rocker, which means, for those who may not be aware, someone who's influenced others greatly. And I have to tell you that Frank Soda was an early influence on me as a guitar player way back when he talked to me about things like string gauges and guitar tone, tuning, etc. So I really do hope that Frank does make his way here to Ontario and we can have a visit before too long. Now, without further ado, here is a song that Frank is widely known for in his live shows exploding a TV on his head. This is called TV People. Enjoy.
This is called TV People.
Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a one-man production, meaning that I've done all the work, including recording, editing, guest acquisition, etc. And hey, here's some news. We've just recently joined forces with 519 magazine, so you can check out my interviews there as well. The theme song for Tommy Solo's Famous Friends is a clip from my original composition, The Burn, all rights reserved. If you enjoy the show and you'd like to help us keep it going, why don't you click on the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes. Hit the like button, subscribe, all that stuff. We really appreciate it. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram. And until next time, cheers.